City Sunday.
In Tuesday's primary, Wisconsin voters rejected 2 referendum questions that would have granted the power to distribute federal funding solely to the legislature. The results of the 2 statewide referendums came as a surprise to some, as constitutional amendments in Wisconsin's primaries are more likely to pass. Like the 2 constitutional amendments in the April primary that passed, those barring election clerks from using private grants to administer elections. Democrats rallied against the proposed amendments with a vote no campaign of coalitions raising more than $3.5 million for the effort, while conservative groups invested less than $300,000 in campaign ads encouraging a yes vote.
They thought by putting it on a lower turnout election was a better way to do it, by having the wording very convoluted, right, on how the amendments were. But we were able to message on it enough that people understood, and we also were able to use it as part of a get out the vote tool, right, to get ready for November. A governor needs to be able to move funds, or someone needs to be able to move funds fast.
Democratic efforts Wisconsin's Republican Representative Derek Van Orden said were effective, but Van Orden believes that the use of those federal dollars deserves legislative oversight.
The Democrat Party of the state of Wisconsin ate the Republican Party of the state of Wisconsin's lunch. The way that they organized themselves and sent out so many mass text messages and flyers and everything explaining what they thought should be done with these constitutional questions, it far and away exceeded the Republican Party's organization skills. I'm not okay with the Democrat governor sticking it to us rural areas, and I wouldn't be okay with a Republican governor sticking it to an urban area or wherever it is. I'm not okay with that because it's not an enumerated power for them. It's for us. We are the representatives.
I sat down with Republican political strategist Brandon Scholz to take a deeper look into how people voted on those referendum questions across various districts. We also dive into the results of some of the state's key national and local races and what those outcomes could mean for Republicans ahead of November. And here with me now is Brandon Scholz, retired Republican political strategist. Brandon, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thanks for having me.
So, Brandon, this was the first election since new legislative maps were enacted. What were some of the more interesting state assembly and Senate races from Tuesday?
What was really interesting is that the expectation was there would be so many competitive races, but when you got down to it in the primary, there were only 47 out of 198 races that were in play that had opponents. That's a quarter of the races. So most all of the races, I think there were 57 of the 99 districts, were unopposed. So of those who had competitive districts, they were a lot of people we didn't know, new candidates. So I don't know that there was some real dynamic changes or results. But the fact is that post-primary, as we get to November, that's where all the action is going to be. You'll have almost 99 races being very competitive between now and November. So the primary was a setup for the big races, for all the big races come November.
Turnout in the August primary was the highest it's been in decades. Madison had about 45% of voter turnout, the highest for a fall partisan primary in nearly 40 years. Is this a sign of voter enthusiasm increasing with Vice President Kamala Harris now leading the Democratic ticket? And should Republicans be concerned ahead of November?
I think one of the biggest reasons for turnout was the referendum. I mean, you saw 26% turnout. You saw 705,000 votes cast in favor, or opposing the referendum. 1.2 million against. That really drove it because of the 46 legislative races. That's not going to turn out 1.2 million. So you saw 5 counties put in almost more than a half million votes on the referendum, and that's what drove the turnout. So I think that's important because that was what the money was spent on. You saw the money spent on those ads, $3 million that did it, and you saw money spent on the Senate race and the congressional races. But I suspect that the turnout, if you look county by county, the biggest counties turned out the biggest numbers because that's where the money was spent to turn people out.
In 2010, Governor Scott Walker won Ozaukee County with 69% of the vote. Republican Senator Ron Johnson with a tighter race of 58% of the vote. And now even smaller margins between Republicans and Democrats on these two proposed constitutional amendments. Is this week's primary an indication of Republicans losing their wide margins of victory in those WOW counties that have been pivotal to winning the presidential election and some of those down ticket races?
That's a really good point, because in the past elections, you've seen Republican margins drop down in the WOW counties, and that's Washington, Waukesha, Ozaukee, and kind of those areas around Milwaukee County. And you've seen Democrat voters increase in Dane and Milwaukee. But in this election, in August, and even though Waukesha, Washington, and Ozaukee voted no on the referendum, I do think that was a function of advertising, a function of referendums are confusing to begin with. People go to the ballot box and they look at it and they go, I don't know, just no. I mean, seriously, that's sometimes what people will spend thinking about. In this case, because the advertising really went against the referendums, that's where people went. And I don't think it wasn't a partisan thing that people got, unless you saw the ads and you saw how the vote no folks were saying this is MAGA Republicans that's going to benefit it. So in that case, it would have an impact. But I don't know that you could read into that you're going to see Republicans lose in WOW counties, even though that margin has gone down. And that's a challenge to Republicans. They have not corrected some of the damage that Donald Trump has done with suburban women. They need to get to that. And their candidates down ballot have to deal with that. So it's still Republican territory. There's still WOW counties. I wouldn't read the referendum as the collapse of Rome. You know, Rome didn't fall down here. Okay, the referendum loss, that shouldn't be a surprise, partially because, well, for a large part, the other side didn't do anything to promote it. So I wouldn't read too much into it. They went against the referendum. They put the money into it. They beat it. You know, it's done. Will that impact them in November? Well, the referendums are done. You're not going to see these two come back. So candidates now will command most of the voters' attention, and that's where they'll bring their numbers back.
Looking ahead to November, Brandon, we saw Trump endorsed a short list of candidates in Wisconsin. How influential was Trump's endorsement for some of those key state and national races?
In this primary in Wisconsin, Trump did not play much at all. He wasn't really in canvassing. He could have endorsed a number of legislative races, but again, you really didn't get that sense that endorsement was way up there in moving candidates. Again, people are paying attention to candidates, what their issues are, and what they talk about at their kitchen table. There is one race, though, that really did happen. Tony Weed in Green Bay ran for Congress in the Republican primary, won. He was endorsed by Trump, fully endorsed, full vote endorsement, everything else. One of his opponents tried to use his support of Donald Trump as part of his race. And the Weed campaign called Trump and said, hey, this guy's pretending he's your friend. So Donald Trump cut an ad for Tony Weed, said, Roger Roth is not my friend. Tony Weed is my friend. Vote for Tony Weed. I think I think that's what happened, and is why Tony Weed won, because of Trump's endorsement and Trump's insertion right at the end that this was his candidate. The other two, Andre Jacques and Roger Roth, weren't. And I think that endorsement played. We put a lot of money up. He put $500,000 into that short race. That made a difference. But I didn't see that in other races around the state to that degree. Yeah, somebody used Trump's endorsement here and there, but I didn't see races changed because of that. The only other one that you probably should note is that the Republican Assembly Speaker, Robin Vos, had always been opposed by the Trump people. They ran recalls against him. They did everything they could. Robin Vos won with 68% of the vote. His opponent dropped out several weeks ago, so that didn't play there at all.
Retired Republican political strategist Brandon Scholz. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.